Professor Jessica Levinson. She is the Associate Clinical Professor of Law at Loyola Law School, from which she is also a cum laude graduate. She clerked for the Honorable James V. Selna and later served as the Director of Political Reform at the Center for Governmental Studies, an institution dedicated to shaping state policy and informing voters. There, she helped craft measures on everything from campaign finance reform to term limits. She appears regularly in all forms of broadcast and print media, and she has written extensively on the intersection of money and politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Jessica Levinson.
I just want to thank the organizers for having me follow Professor Lessig because okay, let's get started. So now that we've heard about where we are, which I completely agree is massively depressing, I'll lead you down that depression just a little bit further and in more detail, which is what I typically do with my students who asked me today if I was going to try and make anyone cry, and I'm not. I just do that with high school students. So I'm going to talk very briefly in 20 minutes or less. Typically, it takes me about 26 hours in a semester to do this, but in 20 minutes or less about the history of campaign finance law. And basically, how did we get here? And you'll have to forgive my PowerPoint skills, which this may be the one that stays up for a while, I have to warn you. So we're just going to have to go with me as the visual for a moment. So we've long been worried about the influence of money over politics. And when did this first really come to the forefront recently? In the Watergate scandals. Thanks to President Nixon, we had a scandal. And what often happens as a result of a scandal, we get reforms. And in the early 1970s, we got the nation's first set of comprehensive campaign finance legislation. And that was the Federal Election Campaign Act, commonly known to us in the industry as the FECA. What a great nickname. And the Federal Election Campaign Act basically did four things. It limited the amount that we can give, contribution limits, and it limited the amount we can spend, expenditure limits. It required more disclosure and transparency so we know who's giving to our elected officials, how are they spending the money. It created a system of public campaign financing on the presidential level, which up until recently was used. And then it created the Federal Election Commission to enforce all of this. And these are still the three main ways that we limit the influence of money in politics. We limit how much I can give you, how much you can spend, we disclose that, or we increase transparency, and we have certain public financing programs. So what happens is, so often happens, Congress passes legislation, and then we take it up to the Supreme Court. So in a case that is still the bedrock of campaign finance law today, in 1976, the Supreme Court decided Buckley versus Vallejo. And I think it's difficult to overestimate how important that decision was for campaign finance law. I mean, it is, I jokingly tell my students, and I hope this doesn't offend them, it's the Bible of campaign finance law. There's something in there for everyone. And what Buckley did is it said, wait, I did spend some time on the PowerPoint, so let's see if we can make this out. Oh, what are we talking about? Just a quick recap of where we've been for the last 4 minutes. Nixon. This is just to make me look good in comparison. The Federal Election Campaign Act and Buckley, here we are. So what does Buckley do? The first thing it does, and I think potentially the most important thing it does, is it says that when I give money or when I spend money in politics, that's either speech or it's speech-like. What does that mean? Anytime we try and restrict our ability to give or spend, it means that we're basically restricting my ability to speak, and therefore we're analyzing those restrictions under the First Amendment. for so many good reasons, our country is very worried about restricting speech. But for so many bad reasons, we're worried about restricting money. But Buckley has basically put us in this corner where wherever we're talking about campaign finance restrictions, we have the First Amendment around our neck. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about everything that Buckley did, but basically it upheld the disclosure requirements, saying, yes, public, you have an interest in knowing who's giving to your candidates, where they're spending the money. It upheld the public campaign financing program. And then it got to the contribution and expenditure limits. And it said, with respect to the contribution limits, those are kind of speech-like. When I give you money, I'm saying I support you. And so we can limit those because they prevent corruption or the appearance of corruption. And this is something that Professor Lessig said so well. The Buckley courts, in the way they describe corruption, was arguably very narrow. Quid pro quo. What does that mean? This for that. That's not the type of corruption that Professor Lessig talked about. The occurs so long as the funders are not the people. This is a narrow conception of corruption. And then the next thing the court said with respect to expenditures is that's speech. So we're going to subject that to the strictest level of review, and we're going to strike that down because we don't think that those restrictions do prevent, again, that narrow corruption or the appearance of corruption. So, oops. All right, well, let's stay there for a second. So what else happened in Buckley? Well, in addition to the so-called Buckley bifurcated framework that created this difference between the treatment of contribution limits, typically okay, and expenditure limits, typically not, is that the court said equalization is not a compelling governmental interest. And this is important to think about today when you're thinking about how do we limit the influence of corporations? Because when we're talking about limiting the influence of corporations, a lot of what we're saying is we're worried about you corporations drowning out or having too much influence. And that starts to sound like we want to hear from other people and we want to equalize the playing field. So again, Buckley kind of boxed us into somewhat of a corner here, saying we can't restrict the speech, meaning the spending, of some to enhance the speech of others. And therefore, we have this problem with, again, the compelling governmental interest defined as corruption and then defined very narrowly. So I talked about Buckley in terms of disclosure, I talked about public financing, and then I talked about the difference between the way they treat contributions and expenditures. But not all expenditures are the same. There were a couple of expenditure limits at issue. One is, I'm running for office, how much I can spend. But another is the so-called independent, and when I'm in class, I use that term in quotes, and now so do my students because I try and make them as cynical as possible. Independent expenditures that are not coordinated with a candidate. And because of the provision at issue in Buckley that limited independent expenditures, the court basically says this limitation applies to ads that use express advocacy, meaning vote for, vote against, elect, or defeat. What does that mean? It means that restrictions don't apply to anything else. So if a corporation, for instance, wants to take out an ad saying, Jessica Levinson goes home and laughs at the neighborhood kids when they fall and, sets cats on fire, and she's running for Congress, it doesn't really say don't vote for me. But we all know that that's really what it's about. And so what Buckley gives rise to, not only this idea that money is speech, but also this huge loophole that creates so-called sham issue ads the ads that are supposedly about trying to save the neighborhood kids and the neighborhood cats, but are really just trying to make sure that I don't get to Congress. And by the end, I'm totally going to have the PowerPoint down. So what happens, part of what our second major piece of campaign finance reform, McCain-Feingold, or the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act does, is it tries to close the loophole on those sham issue ads, saying, we know what that ad about me is about. It's about trying to make sure that I'm defeated. So let's restrict not only the so-called express advocacy, the magic words, but also the functional equivalent, meaning, yeah, it doesn't say that, but we all know what it's about. So again, McCain-Feingold basically does two things. The first, I don't have a lot of time to talk about today, but closing the loophole on so-called soft money. This is soft, literally coined because it is squishy, because it flowed from people to political parties and then back to candidates. But then also, as I said today, to limit these electioneering communications. These communications that are really either saying expressly or essentially saying, elect me or don't elect me. And 1 year later, in 2003, in a case called McConnell versus FEC, because Senator McConnell challenged the law, the court said, sure, that sounds about right to us. This is the moment of the court's deference to campaign finance legislation. Justice O'Connor is still on the bench. There's 5 votes to uphold campaign finance legislation. And we see that playing out in McConnell and the cases just surrounding it. Why do I make this point? Because that is not the Supreme Court that we live with right now. We live with a different 5-4 court. It's 5-4 on the other side. But the question that I want to ask is, not that. What about corporations? So how do we get to McConnell? How do we get to the Supreme Court saying, yes, we're going to uphold this restriction? And what does the restriction specifically say? It says corporations and labor unions, if you want to use general treasury funds, meaning if you want to use your main bank account on electioneering communications, you can't do that 30 or 60 days before the primary or general. You have to use a PAC. You have to specifically solicit funds for a political purpose. And the court in McConnell again says, yes. To fast forward 7 years, what happens in Citizens United? The court says no. So in 6 months or less, how did we get there? It's the court's corporate spending jurisprudence. And Professor Adam Winkler is going to give you a great history on the history of corporate personhood. So I'm going to go kind of quickly on the history of corporate campaign finance spending. But basically, right after Buckley, in 1978, the court decides a case called Bellotti. And in that case, the restriction at issue was preventing certain corporations from spending to pass or defeat ballot measures. It wasn't about candidates, it was about ballot measures. And the question that came up to the court was, do corporations have a First Amendment right to spend the money? And the court, I think in a brilliant kind of shift of what the question was, said, well, the question is whether this speech has First Amendment protection. And does the fact that the speaker, meaning the spender, is a corporation, take away that First Amendment protection? So again, it's a great pivot from who's speaking to the speech itself. We're worried about the speech, and we're not going to deprive that First Amendment speech, again, by which we mean spending, of any protection just because it's a corporation that happens to be spending the money. Brilliant move if you want to strike down restrictions on corporate spending. And that's exactly what the court did. The court focused on, it's all about the listener's right to hear this corporate spending. It's not about whether the corporation as an entity has a First Amendment right to spend the money. Agree with it or disagree with it, but nice change of the issue if you're trying to get to a specific conclusion, which, of course, that would be the first time that the court ever has a results-oriented test. So what happens next? Well, let's live with this graphic for a second, shall we? So in 1990, the court is starting to feel more deferential to campaign finance restrictions. And in a case called Austin, we have the court reviewing a state law that is essentially equivalent to the federal law. It says corporations, you can't use your general treasury funds on independent expenditures. This is before McCain-Feingold, before we've created this new category of electioneering communications. And Austin says, yes, we agree. Corporations should be prohibited from spending this money in the political marketplace. And in Austin, the court goes beyond, again, corruption is a theme here, and the definition of corruption is vitally important. And the court goes beyond this narrow definition of corruption as quid pro quo, this for that. And they say when corporations spend, it can cause a corrosive and distorting effect on the marketplace. It harms electoral integrity. And this is arguably the court's broadest definition of a compelling governmental interest, a broadest definition of corruption that's used to uphold these restrictions. And this becomes known pejoratively in the Citizens United decision as the Austin anti-distortion rationale. And so I asked in the beginning, we'll remember 3 minutes ago, how did we get to McConnell? We got to McConnell, we got to the Supreme Court upholding this portion of McCain-Feingold because of Austin. Because Austin says it can be a broader definition of corruption. It can be this anti-distortion interest. And in McConnell, the court says, yes, and that's why we can uphold the restriction on electioneering communications. So we're in this seemingly good place, and then what happens? Citizens United happens. I know you've all heard a little something about this case. So Citizens United, in 45 seconds or less, says it strikes down the provision that was upheld in McConnell. It says corporations and labor unions, a little dramatic music for you, you have to be able to spend from your general treasury account on electioneering communications. And how does the court get there? Well, Justice Kennedy, in his majority, I would argue, strings together basically a series of his concurrences and his and Justice Scalia's dissents to say a few things are clear. One, speaker-based restrictions on speech are not permissible. By which I mean what? If we can't prohibit individuals from spending this money, then we can't prohibit corporations from doing it either. Meaning corporations must be treated the same as individuals for the purpose of spending money in the political marketplace. Very significant decision. And second, the court says spending that's made independent of candidates cannot be corrupting. Now, this is one of those kind of places where my students chuckle and say, does this pass the laugh test? Well, how does the court get here? The Austin anti-distortion rationale is out. When the court says corruption, the court says Austin was wrong. That's too broad. When we're talking about corruption, we're talking about quid pro quo. We're talking about this for that. Now, it's much easier to say that a restriction does not support a compelling governmental interest or corruption if you define that very narrowly. The best way to say you don't serve this interest is to define it so narrowly that the restriction can fall outside the scope. And that's what happens in Citizens United. The court says these communications that are made independent of candidates cannot corrupt the candidates, in part because corruption is narrowly defined and the Austin anti-distortion rationale, say goodbye, it was the thing of the 90s. So I want to talk really briefly about something you probably have heard about, super PACs. So how does Citizens United lead to super PACs? Because I know that's something, my RA will be very thankful for the chuckles. I know that that's something we've all heard about. So how do we get super PACs? Well, Citizens United allowed for super PACs to happen. In one sense, by saying corporations and labor unions, you have to be treated as the same way as individuals. You have to be able to spend unlimited sums, but also by saying independent expenditures cannot be corrupting. So in a Court of Appeals case called Speech Now, the court said, well, if independent expenditures cannot be corrupting, then we have no reason to limit the contributions to independent expenditures because it serves no purpose to limit those contributions. So what we have is a world in which independent expenditure-only committees, which is what super PACs are, can receive and spend unlimited sums. And super PAC is just so much catchier than independent expenditure-only committees. So that's what super PACs are, but super PACs are a little bit more scary even than that. Because not only can you raise and spend unlimited sums, but what else do we have? It's something that I talked about in the beginning. We have a disclosure problem when it comes to super PACs. Now, super PACs have to disclose where they get their donors. But what's the problem? Some of their donors don't have to disclose. So if I create a 501c4 corporation that's, Jessica Levinson for a better future or a bigger office or a better space in the faculty lounge, then what happens, I don't have to disclose where I get my money from. So what the public gets when they see the disclosure forms for super PACs is Americans for a Better Future, rainbows, sunshine, and smiles, gave to this super PAC. But that doesn't provide us with a whole lot of useful information. So one of the things that I hope we think about today and beyond is how to get that transparency that is desperately necessary for the public to get the information they need to hold officials and these outside organizations accountable. How to get that to the public. And with a whopping 30 seconds left, I couldn't do better than a caped crusader. So I think that I'm going to leave it at that and turn it over to Professor Winkler, who has so many good things to say to you.